I'm Jill Brim, President of the John Whitmer Historical Association. I am delighted to welcome each one of you to our inaugural digital event. This special event is taking the place of our St. George Conference, which has been postponed to October 2021 in the beautiful Red Cliffs of St. George, Utah. The call for papers for the St. George Conference has been extended until April 6, 2021. Please visit the JWHA website for submission instructions. As indicated on our website, JWHA is an independent scholarly society composed of individuals of various religious faiths who share a lively interest in the history of the Restoration movement. Among our members are researchers, instructors, librarians, and those who simply enjoy reading Restoration history. We have members with deep interests in geography, material culture, and law, adding fascinating perspectives to their research. At our conferences, we chat with friends, asking for suggestions about the key actors and available resources in our research areas. At this digital event, Metamorphosis, our speakers will discuss the form and structure of restoration groups as they have changed over time after emerging from crises. Throughout the event, check your screen for the donation link provided. Your donation will help support the JWHA programs as well as our upcoming conference and scholarships. We are honored to have as our MC, Dan Whitmore, JD and CPA, Finance Committee Chair of the JWHA Board. Dan and his wife Beth are closely connected to the University of Denver. They teach a class on Native American rights and have financed endowed scholarship programs for Native Americans in the areas of law and accounting. Dan will open our 2020 digital event with reflections on the theme of scattered and gathered saints who have survived crises. Thank you, Dan.
Welcome. Welcome to our first John Whitmer Historical Association virtual meeting. Well, who's John Whitmer? John Whitmer was the first historian of the Restoration, and our organization recognizes the legacy that he started. John Whitmer Historical Association is an independent, scholarly society composed of individuals of various religious faiths who share a lively interest in the history of the Restoration movement. We will celebrate our 50th year anniversary in 2022. The purpose of the John Whitmer Historical Association is to, one, create and encourage interest in Latter-day Saint history, especially the history of the community of Christ. Two, stimulate scholarly research and publication in the field of Latter-day Saint history. Three, promote communication among scholars of Latter-day Saint history. And four, provide an institutional vehicle for the dissemination of the fruits of scholarly research to members of the Latter-day Saint churches and other interested parties. Our theme for this year's meeting is Metamorphosis, scattered and gathered saints emerge after crisis. What is metamorphosis? It is the passing of one form to another, a transformation, a development change. The Restoration movement encounters crisis after crisis in its developmental years. In New York, Kirtland, Independence, Far West, Nauvoo, and later periods. The movement survived and grew stronger, as our historians can attest. During this era of COVID-19, our gathering emerges in another form, of virtual metamorphosis. We are in a state of health emergency all around us. For that reason, we're not physically gathered together. Today we meet, converse, listen, and learn, and share virtually, and yet it is still very real. Our founder, Joseph Smith Jr., had a virtual experience, and he described it as a vision. In this crisis, we have come together through another form. Today, we do not sit in a hotel, in classrooms, or in a single space together, but we are together and share research, thoughts, presentations, and perspectives. COVID-19 is not the only change in today's world. There are always new forms of life, and today is not an exemption. Our organizations are facing other pressures. One, we have changing membership characteristics and dynamics. Two, some are experiencing decreasing contributions. Three, organizational structure may be changed. Four, we are struggling with this in-between stage of the church. Public protests may lead to social change. Internal tensions are growing. And finally, substantial public square issues of Black Lives Matter, militarization of some police forces, climate change, economic uncertainties, Indigenous peoples' justice issues, LGBTQ inclusiveness, and other changes. We will wait for the next generation of church historians to fairly evaluate if this metamorphosis today results in actual change in the Restoration churches. Today, we share the research and wisdom of two scholars interested in two distinct subjects of the Restoration development and its fruits. The first explores the early development of the RLDS and now Community of Christ movement into the Philippine Islands and the church's first NGO, non-government organization. The second presentation evaluates the confluence of American Indians and the Latter-day Saints. Yes, we are in the era of metamorphosis. How does it affect our scattered and gathered saints after crisis? Dr. David Howlett is an 8th generation member of Community of Christ and is immersed in Restoration history as a specialist in American religions. He is the Mellon Visiting Assistant Professor of Religion at Smith College in Northampton. He taught at Kenyon College, Skidmore College, and Bowdoin College. His work highlights include these areas. One, how religious minorities participate in the development of new centers. Two, the management of internal dissent and differences. And three, develop strategies to distinguish themselves and offer critiques of more powerful groups. Dr. Howlett authored books and many articles. His books are Kirtland Temple, the biography of a shared Mormon sacred space, and co-authored Mormonism, the Basics. This second book illustrates how young religions diversify over time and work out their place within the larger culture. This sounds like metamorphosis. He serves on the advisory board for the Mormon Studies Review and on the editorial board for our own John Whitmer Historical Association journal. Thank you, David. Now listen to this. David Howlett is one of three covering the Community of Christ church historian role. Please welcome Dr. David Howlett.
Hello, I'm David Howlett of Smith College, and I'd like to present tonight a story of the church's founding in the Philippines, a story about the foundation of the first RLDS NGO. Let me share my screen with you, and we'll start the presentation. The story of the evacuees, a Filipino congregation, a Cold War insurgency, and the development of the first RLDS NGO, 1972 to 1974. In 1972, the President of the Philippines, Ferdinand Marcos, declared martial law to target political opponents of his regime. The New People's Army, the armed wing of the Communist Party in the Philippines, struck back, bringing armed conflict to several rural villages in northern Luzon. In one of those villages, members of a growing RLDS congregation found themselves caught in a war zone. This talk draws upon oral history interviews with congregation members who survived the conflict. It details their experiences during the insurgency and their journey to establish new lives and a new congregation in a new place. In the process, this talk narrates the founding of the RLDS Church's first humanitarian NGO and places the congregation's story within a larger context of Cold War politics, religious affiliation in the Philippines, changing understandings of Christian missions, and the rise of transnational faith-based NGOs after World War II. First, though, this talk will provide background to understand the emergence of the RLDS Church in the Philippines in the late 1960s. This image is of a immigration manifest from 1928. I'll tell you why I have that image up in a moment. In 1967, Alfredo de Guzman, a charismatic preacher and farmer from a large family, decided to join a new church with a very long name, the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Two of de Guzman's friends, Maximo Cabida and Potenciano Carino, had joined the church the year before and had been sharing with their friends about their new church community. Cabida, Carino, and de Guzman had all been ministers in the Church of God Seventh Day, a small Adventist church based in the United States. In the early 1930s, Carino had joined this Adventist church when he was an agricultural worker in the US, part of an intercolonial labor system in which tens of thousands of Filipinos, many of them single men, worked for truck farms on the west coast of the US, from Washington to California and to Hawaii in the sugarcane fields. And if you can see this document, if you go down a ways, this is from 1928, you see the name Potenciano Carino from San Manuel, Pangasinan, in the Philippine Islands. And he's being sponsored by the Hawaiian Sugar Planters Association in Honolulu. He goes from there in Hawaii to the west coast of the US, San Francisco, and up and down then the west coast. Carino, after working in the US for more than a decade, returned to the Philippines in 1938, charged with leading the Church of God Seventh Day as the general overseer for the church there. Carino evangelized among his friends and relatives, building up the church by the early 1960s so that it included 350 members in the rural barangays, that's hamlets or villages, rural barangays of northern Luzon. All the while, he kept up a lively correspondence with friends and co-religionists in the US. The mid-20th century Philippines, in which Carino lived, was not quite a denominational society like in the US, where denominational belonging structured religious life, that is, at least in the mid-20th century. Then and now, the Catholic Church was the de facto culture religion of more than 80% of Filipinos. At the time, probably it was more like 90%. However, since the American imperial occupation of the Philippines in the early 20th century, a growing number of foreign churches had begun to compete with the Catholic Church for members. This included mainline American denominations like the United Methodist Church, the Congregational Church, and the Episcopal Church, as well as more conservative American denominations like the Seventh-day Adventists and Jehovah's Witnesses. Indigenous Filipino churches like the Iglesia Ni Cristo and the Iglapayan Church, or the Philippine Independent Church, also made many new converts. Later, American military personnel in Cold War-era Philippines brought with them more religions to the Philippines, such as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or the LDS Church. Carino's story, though, reminds us that it was not just Americans who traveled to the Philippines who then evangelized and created new religious communities there. It was also Filipinos who had lived in the US who imported new churches to the Philippines. In the early 1960s, Carino renewed his correspondence with a Filipino friend with whom he had worked in Oregon in the 1930s. That friend, Benito Malawat, had stayed in the United States and found himself working as a barber in Independence, Missouri, where he subsequently joined the RLDS Church. Malawat sent Carino evangelistic literature from the RLDS Church, hoping that Carino might be persuaded to join it. After reading, discussing, and pondering the literature over the course of several years, Carino and Kabita had a series of meetings with RLDS 70 Dale Bethel, Apostle Charles Nuff, and President of the Council of 12 Apostles, Clifford Cole. Kabita and Carino both decided to join the RLDS Church, and both were ordained as elders in their new church, with Carino being appointed as the national minister and Kabita as his assistant. Former congregation members in Carino's Church of God Seventh-day, like Tomas Andreas, in nearby San Manuel, joined shortly thereafter. A year later, in 1967, Pastor Alfredo de Guzman, Carino's former colleague who lived in a distant mountain village, joined as well. And Alfredo had been also a pastor in the Church of God Seventh-day. Alfredo lived in a small rural barangay or hamlet called Dingading, a place deep in the mountains of the Isabela province in northern Luzon. Alfredo, like most rural Filipinos, was from a large family, and his family regarded him as their spiritual leader. When Alfredo joined the RLDS Church, so did all of his 9 siblings and their children, and this is a picture of Alfredo's last surviving sibling in 2015. That was Lolita de Guzman Carrig. And she was in her 80s at the time. So the de Guzman family and their friends farmed the mountainous hills around Dingading, raising corn, pineapples, and bananas. The work was hard, but the land was fertile. Dingading itself was connected to other barangays by a mountain road that could only be traversed by carabao. It's kind of like a water buffalo, if you will. So carabao and cart. As such, it was a fairly isolated hamlet. By the late 1960s, the president of the Philippines, Ferdinand Marcos, had instituted an authoritarian government that resembled democracy in name only. Backed by the US, Marcos won a second term as president in 1969, and he moved to consolidate his power by squelching the voices of all his opponents. This led to further resistance. Some of these resistance groups sought peaceful means of change, while some argued that change could only happen by the use of force. The New People's Army, the military wing of the Filipino Communist Party, began to organize in rural areas and cities to oust Marcos and bring about a revolution in the Philippines. Armed conflict ensued between government forces and the forces of the NPA, especially in rural mountainous areas that the NPA favored for its base of operations. And one of these areas was the small village of Dingading. The first NPA forces moved into the area around Dingading by 1969. These individuals were largely organizers. They came in small groups and they were lightly armed. However, due to the rural location and the isolation from other barangays and government forces, Dingading was effectively controlled by the NPA, and the NPA moved about its forests surrounding the village. NPA organizers might enter a home and ask for the people to feed them, or NPA soldiers would arrive at one's doorstep with rice, and a family would be expected to cook it for them. No one dared to be a bad host. In a significant escalation of the conflict between Marcos and the NPA, the president declared martial law in the Philippines on the 23rd of September, 1972, inaugurating a 14-year-long period of martial law that would only end with his ouster as the president of the Philippines in 1986. Ostensibly, Marcos had declared martial law in response to bombings by NPA forces in Manila. These attacks gave Marcos the political cover to move decisively against all political opponents, whether or not they were connected with the NPA. Historian Richard Kessler notes that Marcos subsequently mythologized the NPA, investing it with a revolutionary aura that only attracted more supporters. In the ensuing conflict, Marcos engaged in aggressive counterinsurgency operations against the NPA across the nation. In the area around Dingading, government forces moved in with heavily armed soldiers and even boasted a few tanks and machine guns to support their counterinsurgency operations. The NPA also boosted their forces, sending in what they called encounter forces. Those were a few dozen soldiers who were heavily armed, though they lacked the vehicles driven by the Filipino army. Dingading had become a war zone. The 20 families that made up the Dingading congregation faced unnerving and dangerous day-to-day conditions. Government soldiers made a base within their village, thus leaving the villagers open to attack by the NPA. Families worried about stepping on mines and being caught between forces and ambushes, and their fears were well-founded. From late September to October 1972, NPA forces engaged government forces in 4 different firefights in Dingading, resulting in civilian as well as military casualties. Wenceslao de Guzman, this is him in 2015, at the time a young man, Wenceslao de Guzman remembers that local men in Dingading were conscripted to be part of what were called then Barrio Defense Units, a barrio and barangay, about the same thing basically. Barrio Defense Units. They were forced to operate checkpoints in these units and guard the government camp in their village, thus putting them potentially in the line of fire between NPA and regular government forces. Furthermore, the conscripted farmers like Wenceslao worried that when they returned home after guarding the camps and checkpoints, they would then be killed in their fields by the NPA, who observed them guarding the checkpoints by day. With the advent of martial law, the government forces became far crueler to the local people, too. Individuals suspected of being NPA had virtually no rights and could be summarily beaten or even killed. The intermittent fighting between the NPA and government forces only increased. Marcy de Guzman remembers leading a group of student scouts to a town along a road, passing by some government soldiers. Once the group was 50 yards beyond the soldiers, the government soldiers were ambushed by the NPA forces, who had been waiting for them all along. The sounds of gunfire and helicopters became a daily occurrence in the small hamlet. Dalia Valdez, she's on the left there in the picture, when a child at the time, in this 1972, said that while the gunfire frightened her, she and other children soon took the sounds of gunfire as part of their everyday lives. However, some experiences proved to be especially traumatic for the children. Jesse de Guzman, and he's on the right here, in this picture. He was 10 years old at the time. He remembers being at school one day when the children heard that there had been an ambush of several city officials and military officers. The NPA had killed several of them. Jesse knew that his father, a counselor to the barangay captain, basically like being a counselor to the mayor. So a counselor to the barangay captain worked closely with the military. And Jesse sat down on the ground and wept as he worried that his father had been killed. When Jesse returned to his home, his father was missing. His mother did not know where his father was, and they were greatly worried. Then a government helicopter swept down on their home, and a man fell out. The man got up and then walked towards Jesse. It was his father. Earlier in the day, and unknown to the family, Jesse's father had been taken by government forces to identify the bodies of those who had been killed in the ambush. It was a terrifying day for the family, but at the end of it, Jesse cried tears of relief as he embraced his father. I really like that story too, because you think about what memories would you remember as a child? This is exactly how a childhood memory basically is what I'm saying with this. So it's interesting as a historical source as well. By October 1972, the government of Isabela, the province in which the village of Dingading was located, ordered the population of the entire region to evacuate so that government forces could move in and defeat the rebel forces. As political scientist Matthew Bolton points out, this was not unlike the strategic Hamlet strategy employed by the US and South Vietnamese governments in rural Vietnam in the late 1950s and early 1960s, a strategy that sought to move rural populations away from communist forces so that the relocated villagers would ally with the government. However, the government offered no help to the people whom they ordered to evacuate from the area. Villagers had to fend for themselves and move all that they could in 1 week. Children like Dalia Valdez remembered walking 15 kilometers from her home to the town of San Guillermo, where most of the evacuees gathered. Others remember taking some possessions by carabao, but no one had a car to help them. Most people simply carried their few possessions, including food for the journey. Once they left their homes, the government soldiers moved in and killed the remaining livestock for food. Marcia de Guzman, this is a picture of her in 2015. Marcia de Guzman, a school teacher and the wife of Alfredo's nephew, Cesar, wrote a letter with Alfredo and addressed it to Apostle Charles Neff. They explained their dire situation and requested direct assistance from the church. In response, Neff and the Filipino church leaders decided on a bold plan of action. Alfredo had a sister who lived in a village called Simiban, hours away from Dingading, in the neighboring state of Rojas. There was land available for sale in Simiban too. Church leaders saw a chance here to give members of the Dingading congregation a new start in a new place. To do so, though, they would require a new organization that the RLDS Church at the time did not have, a humanitarian NGO. Consequently, they formed Community One Vocational Foundation Incorporated, later renamed Community One Resources Development, or CORD. Legally incorporated in the Philippines on December 6, 1972, the first board for this organization included Pastor Alfredo de Guzman of Dingading, Pastor Maximo Cabida of Binalonan, RLDS Bishop of East Asia, Kenneth Chung Ming, Pastor Thomas Andreas of San Manuel, Walter Coward of Cornell University and the Philippines-based Institute for Rural Reconstruction, and Apostle Charles Neff. Through the auspices of the new NGO, church leaders borrowed $25,000 from the RLDS presiding bishopric and purchased house lots and rice fields in Simiban. Each church family was given 2 hectares of land to farm, with the understanding that they would pay back the church at 1% interest over 12 years after a built-in 3-year delay of repayment. So they wanted to give them time to actually raise crops and get enough going so that they wouldn't immediately have to be paying off their loans. While the evacuees squatted on land or stayed in the yards of acquaintances in the small town of San Guillermo in Isabela province, Alfredo de Guzman and Charles Neff implemented the first stage of their resettlement plan and sent 8 families to Simibon. So Alfredo actually selected those 8 families to send. Many of the first 8 families only sent 1 or 2 family members ahead to work the land and grow the first crops, while others stayed in San Guillermo. Cesar de Guzman remembers how he struggled to clear the thick grass from the field fields to plant his first crop of rice. The church had hired a technician who advised the evacuees, as they were called by locals. We'll get to that in a moment. But the church hired a technician to advise the evacuees on planting this new crop. But it was still difficult work. Cesar remembers that the first few crops were not very good, and he worked his plot alone while his family lived in San Guillermo. Meanwhile, his wife Marcy taught school in San Guillermo, and she was pregnant at the time. She eventually had her baby while in San Guillermo. 30 years later, that baby, Jennifer de Guzman Gutierrez, would become the first woman to serve as Community Christ Mission Center president in the Philippines. And there you see Jennifer in the turquoise blouse. By 1974, 12 more families had joined the first 8 families in the barangay of Simibon, including Dalia's family. Dalia, in an interview she conducted with me in 2015, remembered this experience, and she told me how relieved she was to be finally away from fighting and the threat of daily violence. Dalia's family and the 19 other families formed a group that locals in the surrounding area somewhat derisively called the evacuees. It became both something that people identified with and something occasionally used to undermine folks to make them as an out group. But it became a name for the new group of people in Simibon. These 20 families met for church at Alfredo de Guzman's new home in Simibon. Their congregation would grow to become the largest RLDS congregation in the Philippines. And there's a picture from 75 of the church building, which is Alfredo's home. Resettlement and agricultural training were not the only projects that CORD implemented in Simibon. By 1977, CORD had partnered with a new independent RLDS NGO founded by Charles Neff and based in Independence, Missouri. That organization, Outreach International, founded several CORD-sponsored projects in Simibon, including an animal husbandry program, similar to those sponsored by Heifer International, the construction and staffing of a nutrition center, the construction of a small warehouse to store crops, and the organization of a farmers cooperative. Thus, CORD and Outreach International assisted in building a community infrastructure for the new residents of Simibon. As such, they saw their efforts as an experiment in sustainable community living, not just an effort to provide emergency aid. The experience of the evacuees who established the RLDS Simibon congregation illustrates several wider stories observed by scholars of global Christianity and American religious history. First, the establishment of CORD as a church-affiliated NGO tracks with a more expansive story of transnational connections between American Christians and other Christians living at the periphery of American empire. Namely, in the post-World War II era, faith-based NGOs with transnational connections proliferated within the US, and they worked primarily in places where the US had an extensive military presence or significant political suasion. Some faith-based NGOs, like Lutheran World Relief or Catholic Relief Services, had explicit denominational connections. Others, like the independent evangelical organization World Vision, were allied with people within very specific non-denominational conservative religious milieus, in this case, independent evangelicals, right? Nonetheless, they all evidenced an international hunger for global connection beyond the lines of nationality, as well as a trend among many Christians to re-envision the work of missions from primarily proselytizing endeavors to supposedly more neutral humanitarian aid endeavors. And of course, nothing is ever neutral, right? This is also caught up in Cold War politics. Nevertheless, the RLDS Church followed this trend as evidenced by the establishment of CORD in the Philippines. Historian Dima Hurlbut has observed a similar trend within the RLDS Church's establishment in southeastern Nigeria in the very same era. Yet, the rationale and appeal of CORD also diverged in select ways from other faith-based NGOs in the same era. Anthropologist Britt Halverson notes that contemporary medical aid is, quote, appealing to Christian actors because of the non-interference and cultural distance ostensibly made possible by the relief aid model, in contrast with the face-to-face encounters and cultural imperialism of colonial evangelism. So what she's saying is that basically this new model is a reaction against what they see as older models. The distance model is more appealing because it feels like it's not as entangled as much with imperialistic ideas as the older models of face-to-face evangelism. I just want to say, though, if we look at how CORD is formed, we have to rethink a little bit about that idea about the distance involved. In contrast to these observations by Halverson about the appeal of distance relationships, let's think for a moment about the appeal of this for Filipinos. Filipinos who wrote to American RLDS officials for relief aid did not base their appeals upon distanced, disinterested, disconnected benevolence, but appealed for aid that was community interested, connected through their own social networks, and personal. The Filipinos who served on CORD's first board, like Pastor Alfredo de Guzman of Dingading and Pastor Maximo Cabita, had face-to-face relationships with Americans like Neff and the Filipino church members of Dingading, and of course, de Guzman was one of them. CORD came into being because Filipinos could leverage these relationships. And these relationships had not simply been forged in the short years between the RLDS Church's founding in the Philippines and the evacuation. These relationships were also constructed in the decades that have preceded these events, such as Potenciano Carino's transnational friendship with Benito Malawat. The personal is global, argues development studies scholar Glenda Tibe Bonifacio, and that was a phrase she actually used in a study of Filipino aid organizations. During the global 1970s, the Filipinos in this story, like Carino and de Guzman, as well as the Americans like Neff, exemplified this truism. Thank you.
Thank you, David. You introduced us to new insights on the development of the Philippine missions and the first Community of Christ, NGO. We have time for a few questions now. Mr. Howlett will address them as time permits.
Well, hello. We have a couple of questions. I have about 5 minutes here. So a question from Rachel Braithwaite. How are RLDS NGOs funded? So Community of Christ NGOs today are, there's a relationship to the church that's more in terms of like name. It's less, it's not actually affiliated directly with the church. But a group, Outreach International, for instance, based in Independence, Missouri, most of the folks who fund outreach happen to be Community of Christ members. So it's like the idea of having an independent NGO, but something that's almost an auxiliary or something that is folks in Community of Christ recognize as part of Community of Christ. So Community of Christ folks fund outreach, and even congregations will at times have like a jar. I remember when I was in their congregation for donations for Outreach International. In Outreach International, oftentimes, which is a US-based NGO, will fund other affiliated NGOs like Outreach Philippines International and sometimes CORD, and sometimes NGOs in India. So it's a way in which you have NGOs across the world affiliated in loose ways with the Community of Christ. There's a certain kind of funding structure that goes with that. And those NGOs, too, across the world will partner with other NGOs. They'll bundle their services together to complete a project. And, of course, those NGOs, too, will apply for funding and funds from local governments, like Filipino agricultural grants, or grants from the government of India. So in those ways, the NGOs are funded from multiple sources on the ground in many different places. So Kathy Robinson makes a comment that she was in the Philippines with Outreach International in the Isabela area in the mid-1970s and went to the church there, as well as seeing the soldiers at checkpoints. Our church people were brave and committed for sure. So, yep, that first generation of Filipino members there were extraordinarily committed. And yes, so I should probably interview you, Kathy. I'm still working on this project. It says turn up my volume. There we go. Maybe that's better. I was maybe a little too soft. So there we go. So yes, I'm hoping to continue actually on this project a little bit more. I think one of the interesting things that makes Community of Christ enter this ecumenical world, part of the way in which Community of Christ becomes more of an ecumenical church is not simply by thinking about the doctrine that it espouses or having folks go to seminary. Those are ways in which it becomes more ecumenical. Another way it becomes more ecumenical, honestly, is by having NGOs, a structure that many other churches in the greater Christian world have too. And it's a way of interacting with people in new ways, a way of forming partnerships in new ways, like Heifer International, for instance. Outreach partners with them in the Philippines often. And of course, that's a brethren-based NGO. So this is also a way in which Community of Christ in the 60s, in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and into the present becomes more of an ecumenical church. So those are the questions that I have. Yeah. I think that was about it. I may be out of time too. I've been talking for probably 5 minutes. If you do have any other questions, feel free to email me, dhowlett, it's HOWLETT, at smith.edu. I'd be happy to answer your questions. Or if you have stories you'd like to share with me that you have experience with outreach in the Philippines, I'd love to hear those stories as well.
Thank you, David, longtime member of JWHA, for your fascinating presentation and research. At this time when we have been sequestered, we are grateful to be able to read the John Whitmer Journal and selections offered by John Whitmer Books. We thank the editors, editorial boards, and contributing authors of John Whitmer Journal and John Whitmer Books for all their efforts. JWHA is now planning our upcoming St. George Conference, hoping to offer scholarships to students of Restoration history. Please find the donation link on your screen and consider giving to JWHA. Help us continue our significant efforts with the John Whitmer Journal, John Whitmer Books, our upcoming conference, and scholarships. Thank you very much. Thank you as well to the sponsors of our digital event.
In Joseph and Lucy Smith's Tunbridge Farm, an archaeology and landscape study, we have looked carefully at physical evidence left behind by the Smith family. We have also uncovered new documentary sources, and together this information sheds light on Joseph and Lucy Smith's family in late 18th century Tunbridge Gore, Vermont. Joseph and Lucy's 43-acre farm was in the middle of Smith settlement, where they started a family together. Here, Lucy sought the change of heart described by her sisters that led to her own first vision.
This is Bill Russell, and I am speaking to you from Lamoni, Iowa. 14 of us gathered at the home of Dick and Barbara Howard in September 1972 to organize a historical society focused primarily on the RLDS Church and the other churches that separated from the LDS or RLDS churches. We chose the name John Whitmer Historical Association because John Whitmer was the first church historian, and he never went to Utah, and he never joined the RLDS Church. My motion to adopt the name John C. Bennett died for lack of second. We did include LDS members and include some LDS topics in our meetings as well as in our journal, which we introduced in 1980. We continue to do so today. Our first annual meeting was held at Nauvoo in September 1973. We have held them at cherished historical sites during the last weekend of September ever since. In 2002, we added a full day to our annual meetings, running from Thursday night through Sunday noon. In the early years, we were small, often with about 50 people at our annual meetings, but we have had up to 230 since, and our membership has exceeded 400. And thus, we remain scholarly, solvent, and smug on our 50th birthday.
Dr. Jane Hafen is new to the John Whitmer Historical Association, and what a wonderful perspective she brings to us. Her tradition is with the Taos Pueblo in New Mexico. Today we hear that voice. Dr. Hafen is Professor Emerita of English at the University of Nevada at Las Vegas. She studied at the University of Nevada and Brigham Young University. Ruth Hafen has written books, many articles, and book chapters. She wrote the book, Reading Louise Erdrich's Love Medicine. She edited and co-edited several books. Number 1, Dreams and Thunder Stories, Poems of the Sundance Opera by Zitkala Saw. 2, Critical Insights, Louise Erdrich. And 2 larger compilations that she co-edited. The first, The Great Plains Readers, that shares essays of many stories of the era of the development of the Great Plains during the same time period in which the LDSs trekked westward. The second book that she co-edited is entitled Essays on American Indian and Mormon Journal and Mormon History. This book was just published last year, and I acquired this at the auction at the John Whitmer Historical Society annual meeting in Palmyra, New York. And I've been reading portions of these essays to better understand the point of view and conflict of colonialism and how it relates to Mormons. I am so excited that we have this speaker today. When I received this book, little did I know that I would be introducing the co-author tonight. Dr. Hafen was awarded the University of Nevada Foundation Award for Distinguished Teaching. Her education roots are strong as she received, as a student at BYU, the Dean Scholarship Award for Outstanding American Indian Student. She is currently on the boards of Charles Reed Center for Western Studies and the Michigan State University Press American Indian Series. On a personal basis, I have focused much attention on justice issues for all Indigenous peoples. In understanding these issues, I found it most important to hear directly from Native Americans, to hear their stories, their worldview, and their experiences of innumerable injustices inflicted upon them by the dominant culture. I am excited tonight to introduce Dr. Jane Hafen and learn her perspective on the title, nor any manner of ites, American Indians and Mormons.
Thank you for the invitation to speak to you. I'm speaking from the ancestral land and traditional home of the Taino, the Southern Paiutes, or the desert people. Wherever you are, I hope you will honor and give thanks to the indigenous people on whose land you dwell. I do not consider myself a historian. I am retired from an academic career in American Indian literature and studies. I am indigenous, Taos Pueblo, for life. I speak for myself and from my own experience. I do not represent any group or any others. My talk this evening is about American Indian peoples and Mormon history. Yes, I still use both those terminologies. I will begin with an introduction to indigenous methodology and decolonization in a literary example. Then I will discuss how Mormon history can be decolonized. According to Dakota scholar Elizabeth Cook Lynn, the foundation of American Indian studies are land, language, and sovereignty. Further, Choctaw writer Leanne Howe has developed an indigenous methodology called tribalography. As she explains, Native stories, no matter what form they take, novel, poem, drama, memoir, film, history, seem to pull together all the elements of the storyteller's tribe, meaning the people, the land, and multiple characters and all their manifestations and revelations, and connect these in past, present, and future milieus, present and future milieus meaning non-Indians. Tribalography comes from the native propensity for bringing things together, for making consensus, and for symbiotically connecting one thing to another. These critical approaches place indigenous thought as the source and the center of examining issues regarding Native peoples, regardless of academic discipline. They disrupt colonialism and, importantly, resist appropriation of Native thought into the colonial critical discourse or traditional literary criticism or historiography. They not only address the fundamental need for physical survival, but also address intellectual endurance. They constitute what White Earth Ojibwa writer Joe Visner calls survivance, survival and persistence. Sometimes literary authors are those who must tell histories that historians cannot or will not tell. One of the best examples is the chronicling of 19th century Blackfeet Pecuni life by James Welch in his novel Fool's Crow. Relying on the stories of his grandmother who survived the massacre at the Marias River, Welch uses language, land, and sovereignty to tell an indigenous history. Last spring, National Book Award winner Ojibwa writer Louise Erdrich published the story of her grandfather and his resistance to the termination policies of the 1950s in a novel called The Night Watchman. The main character, Thomas Wajak, works diligently to prevent the Turtle Mountain Chippewa from disenfranchisement. His actions are documented, so while this is a novel, it is also representative of indigenous history and Mormon history. The primary architect of tribal termination is Senator Arthur V. Watkins of Utah. Erdrich cleverly creates fictive characters but leaves in names the real Watkins. Upon his identification as Mormon, his purpose is identified by the Chippewas. Quote, "It's in their religion to change Indians into whites. It's in their holy book. The more we pray, the lighter we get. They think if you follow their ways, your skin will bleach out. They call it lightsome and gladsome," end of quote. Along the way, Erdrich creates a space for Chippewas to encounter and understand Mormons and Mormon attitudes toward indigenous peoples. The first is in an encounter with missionaries in the Turtle Mountain Reservation. Their storyline takes a comedic turn that plays on naive sincerity. An elder asks Thomas, "Have you ever wondered why you are here?" "No," said Thomas. "Why not?" "Because I know," said Thomas. "Don't you?" Thomas speaks to his mother-in-law. "They just want to know if we wonder why we are here." Her literal response, "You took our land. Where else were we supposed to go?" In Erdrich's historical rendering, Arthur Watkins grew up on an allotment parcel of land stolen from the JWHA Indians. He would use the power and influence of his office to rid the country of Indians. Quote, "In Watkins' religion, the Mormon people had been divinely gifted all the land they wanted. Indians weren't white and delightsome, but cursed with dark skin, so they had no right to the land." End of quote. Thomas successfully challenges Watkins, and the Turtle Mountain Chippewa were not terminated. However, 113 other tribes were terminated, notably the Utes and Paiutes of Utah, whose rights were later restored. Erdrich's book tells indigenous history, demonstrates survivance, and her narrative decolonized the aims of Mormon missionaries and the Mormon author of Termination. Let me suggest some ways Mormon history, and specifically the Book of Mormon, can be decolonized by looking at issues of origins, institutional racism, and shifting positions of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. First is the issue of origins. Joseph Smith's assertion that the people of the Book of Mormon were descendants from the 12 tribes of Israel was consistent with other hypotheses dating back to Sam Purchas in the 17th century. A major issue for Western colonizers was whether or not the peoples of the Western Hemisphere had souls. The Book of Mormon proposes to answer those questions with the Lehite and Jaredite narratives. The issue of origin also has legal and philosophical implications. If native peoples arrived via boat, barge, or even across the Bering Strait, as Spencer Kimball acknowledged was a possibility, they lose original claim to land, no matter how long the tenure. They could be categorized simply as other immigrants. Here's a novel thought. Why not ask native peoples where they came from? Their answers are founded in origin stories, and those origin stories connect to the land. My own people emerged through the sacred Blue Lake in the mountains around Taos Pueblo. Further, the Book of Mormon colonizes indigenous people by providing an origin story that dismisses the varied origins of tribes. Decolonizing the Book of Mormon would require the paradox of acknowledging traditional indigenous beliefs alongside scriptural text. Another way to decolonize the Book of Mormon is to address and dismiss the racial prejudices created in the narrative. Easy to say. The story is familiar. The families of Lehi, Ishmael, and their wives and children begin as a community. Continuing conflict between Nephi and Laman and Lemuel leads to a breach. Lamanites, as they come to be known, are cursed with a dark skin. And it came to pass that I beheld, after they had dwindled in unbelief, they became a dark and loathsome and a filthy people, full of idleness and all manner of abominations. Although more recent editions of the Book of Mormon modify the contrast of whiteness with the dark-skinned Lamanites by changing white and delightsome to pure and delightsome, the cultural implications persist. Visual representations of the Lamanites are those of dark-skinned peoples, while Nephites maintain white supremacy. While one may question the historicity of the Book of Mormon narrative, certainly the rhetoric plays into attitudes of racism in practical ways in modern America. The constructions of whiteness and settler colonialism are enabled by the Book of Mormon. I would refer you to the good work of Dakota scholar Elise Boxer for discussion of Settler Colonialism in Mormon History, and Joanna Brooks' new book on white supremacy. A careful reading of the Book of Mormon reveals that there were times when the Nephites were more wicked than the Lamanites, and the Nephites were ultimately destroyed because of their wickedness. Nevertheless, the division by skin color prevails in historical and systemic racism against Native peoples, especially in the Western American region of Mormonism. The Latter-day Saints arrived in Salt Lake City in 1847. Whose land was it? How did the Mormons obtain title to the land? Was it a carryover of the doctrine of discovery? After the Utah Territory became part of the United States, did Mormons attain the land through treaty, by purchase, through the Allotment Act? Here are just some of the systemic racism and violent events in Intermountain history. 1849, 4 Indians killed. 1850, the battle at Fort Utah, more than 100 Indians killed. 1853, the Walker War. 1857, the Mountain Meadows Massacre, blamed on the Paiutes. 1863, the Bear River Massacre, the largest massacre of Indians in United States history. 1850s and 60s, the purchase of Indian children. 1865, the Black Hawk War, including massacre of Indians at Grass Valley and at Circleville, reenacted in 1913 in Ephraim, Utah, and on a continuing basis. Additionally, Black Hawk's bones were disinterred and put on public display in the Church History Museum, and battles were reenacted with red face. 1915, the Bluff War in San Juan County. Until 2018, the sham battle reenactment at Wellsville with actors dressed in red face. This year, Utah has celebrated their 150-year heritage of women's suffrage, along with the commemoration of the centennial of the 19th Amendment, allowing white women to vote. However, rarely mentioned is the accompanying fact that Utah was the last state to grant Indians voting rights in 1957. And now there is the current debacle over Indian voting rights in San Juan County, with non-Indians desiring to secede after being judicially mandated to allow Navajos and Utes the right to representation. This group is the same contingent that opposes the designation of barriers as a national monument, despite the support from 5 local tribes. Include the Bundy fiasco, where, according to a paper I heard by Christina Rossetti, the Bundys justify their claim to the land explicitly based on their perception of degenerate Lamanites, the Paiutes. It doesn't take a genius to observe that this despicable history, while not distinct from general American history, is particularly influenced and justified by attitudes toward so-called Lamanites as set forth in the Book of Mormon. One solution of decolonization is to indigenize this history. That is, to recognize its complicated nature and reconsider the powers of settler colonialism, as well as the historical narratives to justify their actions. To accept the settler colonial narrative is systemic racism. While not specifically racist, but certainly colonialist, the Book of Mormon falls into a pattern of preoccupation with indigenous peoples as a vanishing race. It is a trope that assumes an inevitability. Estimates vary about the population of indigenous peoples in 1491 from 8 million to 200 million. By 1900, there were about 200,000 American Indians in the United States. This decline was due to a number of factors, including virgin soil diseases, violence, and assimilation. The institutional intention was to kill the Indian and save the man. Even as late as 1947, when the Indian Placement Program was instituted, there was an assumption that native skin would turn white and indigenous peoples would be saved and no longer function as tribes. Like James Fenimore Cooper's The Last of the Mohicans, the narrative of the Book of Mormon assumes the tragic end of a race. The text itself is a series of farewell sermons. Lehi's blessings to his sons, Nephi's farewell, King Mosiah's farewell, and the lonely image of Mormon in the plates, culminating in Moroni's final farewell and admonition with the destruction of the Nephites. There are prophecies of the scattering of the surviving Lamanites. Indeed, every tribal nation I know has an apocalyptic moment when their universe changes forever. Often, this is a violent encounter with settler colonialism, changes to a way of life, and the loss of land. N. Scott Momaday writes about the last Kiowa Sundance in 1887. My grandmother was 10 when the Kiowas came together for the last time as a living Sundance culture. They could find no buffalo. They had to hang an old hide from the sacred tree. Before the dance could begin, a company of soldiers rode out from Fort Sill under orders to disperse the tribe. Forbidden without cause, the essential act of their faith, having seen the wild herd slaughtered and left to rot upon the ground, the Kiowas backed away forever from the medicine tree. It was July 20th, 1890, at the Great Bend of the Washita. My grandmother was there. Without bitterness, and for as long as she lived, she bore a vision of deicide. Not until the American Indian Religious Freedom Act on August 11, 1978, were indigenous peoples given permission to openly practice their religious beliefs. Friends, brothers, and sisters, if you want to learn what threatens religious freedom, consider the history of indigenous peoples in America and how they were forbidden by policy and by law to practice their sacred rituals. Admittedly, Momaday's description sounds like a fulfillment of the vanishing Indian. However, Momaday himself lives to write the story. Telling and recovering tribal stories is a decolonization. Bearing witness is not the end of the trail, but looking forward. The story of indigenous peoples is a tale of survival against amazing odds. To be an Indian in the 21st century is a testament that your people have survived disease, survived violence, survived structural attempts at assimilation. Stories of survivance resist, tragic disappearance, and the sad narrative of the Lamanite. Claiming our own stories is decolonizing by refuting the language of racism rationalized in aggression toward Indians. In 2018, the 40th anniversary noted the revelation, all worthy males will be granted the priesthood. The good work of Paul Reeve, Quincy Newell, and others has elaborated the necessary discourse about race in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and Mormon culture. Race in this context means black and white. I have yet to hear much discussion about race in terms of indigenous peoples, yet it permeates our foundational scripture and history. In a shameless self-promotion, Brendan Rensink and I are trying to rectify this erasure and have edited a collection titled Essays on American Indian and Mormon History. We are grateful for the award and acknowledgement from the John Whitmer Historical Society. In this anthology, authors address some of the complications of race relations. Essays cover the historical construction of the Lamanite, settler colonialism in the Book of Mormon, and connections between Seneca leader Handsome Lake and Joseph Smith. Authors also address American Indian Mormon tribal identities, Navajo and Mormon participation at the dedication of the Glen Canyon Dam, the impact of Mormon Polynesian missionaries in JWHA, the Indian Student Placement Program, and other topics. Prominent in American Indian Mormon voices lend their creative work and personal experiences to the book. With the aim of avoiding familiar narrative patterns of settler colonialism, contributors seek to make American Indians the subjects rather than the objects of discussion in relation to Mormons, presenting new ways to explore and reframe these relationships. Our objective is decolonization. Another current and important project of decolonization is the establishment of a Shoshone monument to tell the story of the Bear River Massacre. Northern Shoshone Darren Perry tells the story of his family, how he descends from Sagwitch, who survived the massacre and later joined the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Perry tells, reclaims, and decolonizes the frank history of the massacre. Larry Echohawk, a member of the Pawnee Nation, served as a General Authority Sunday from 2012 to 2018. In his only General Conference address, he spoke of his personal conversion and the Book of Mormon, while also relating his tribal history. They are not mutually exclusive. During the dedication of the Mountain Meadows Massacre Memorial, Henry Eyring apologized, saying, "A separate expression of regret is owed the Paiute people, who have unjustly borne for too long the principal blame for what occurred during the massacre." In Circleville, where 30 Paiutes were massacred during the Black Hawk War, a new monument was erected and dedicated in 2016. Significantly, the Paiute version of the story is part of the monument. The LDS Church contributed to its construction and its narrative. According to church historian Richard Turley, students of history of the West will tell you that if you tabulate the data, the Indians were more often the victim than the aggressor. It is a different narrative than we had back when I was growing up. All of these discussions are moving the Book of Mormon away from an unsustainable hemispheric literalism. According to Jana Reese's The Next Mormons, only half of millennials, 62% of boomers, and 53% of Gen Xers believe the Book of Mormon is a literal historical account. These developments are other acts of decolonization. So let me conclude by suggesting that the Book of Mormon itself offers some keys and principles in decolonizing history. If, as James writing in, and Seminole scholar Susan Miller aver, that colonialism is a crime against humanity, the decolonizing remedy is to treat each other with kindness and respect, to overcome our prejudices, to step out of our comfort zones and rethink what we have believed our whole lives, to set in practice the principles of the gospel of Jesus Christ. While decolonization is a theoretical methodology, it is also a way of describing how we can attempt to be more inclusive, kind, and act charitably one toward another. Consider these scriptures from the Book of Mormon. The Lord inviteth them all to come unto him, and partake of his goodness. And he denieth none that come unto him, black and white, bond and free, male and female. And he remembereth the heathen, and all are alike unto God, both Jew and Gentile. Finally, of the American Indian Mormons I know, none self-identify as Lamanite. Becoming one in Christ requires giving up the categories and their accompanying prejudices. And it came to pass that there was no contention in the land because of the love of God, which did dwell in the hearts of the people. There were no robbers, nor murderers, neither were there Lamanites, nor any manner of ites, but they were all in one, the children of Christ, and heirs to the kingdom of God. Ta'u, thank you.
Dr. Hafen, thank you for helping us understand the historical implications and consequences of Latter-day Saint interactions with Native Americans. We particularly appreciate your perspective. History to be reported accurately must include all perspectives. Now we have some time for a few questions. Dr. Hafen will address them as time permits.
Dr. Hafen is currently experiencing connection issues. If you'd like to ask questions, please type them in the box and she'll respond to you directly. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hafen. We appreciate your insights and your participation in the JWHA inaugural digital event. Upcoming, we will have some videos and then proceed on to the Hymn Fest. Thank you.
Hi, this is Seth Bryant, Chair of the JWHA Membership Committee. Seeking new members is nothing new for me. I was once a missionary in North Carolina who knocked thousands of doors to find new members for my church. One day we knocked on this door and a child answered. "Mom's not home," she said. "Well, that's fine," I replied. "Tell her that we'll bring the check by later." Just then, miraculously, Mom appeared from around the corner. "No, ma'am," I replied. "I said that we'd check by later." But now that we have you, we'd like to tell you about our church. I'll tell you what isn't a hard sell: an annual membership to JWHA. In addition to receiving the JWHA Journal in the spring and fall, members get discounts at our conferences and full voting rights. If you haven't joined already, we'd love to have you. And for you longtime members, please consider inviting family and friends to this one-of-a-kind organization that promotes incredible restoration history. Go to jwha.info/membership to join or renew today. Thanks.
Alone we have wandered as strangers in sin, and cried in the desert for thee. Our foes have rejoiced when our sorrows they see, but Israel will shortly be free. As children of Zion, the tidings for us, the tokens already appear. Fear not and be just, for the kingdom is ours, and the hour of redemption is near.
Redeemer of Israel is one of the earliest hymns of the church. It was written by W.W. Phelps. He was inspired by the lyrics of the hymn, "O Thou in whose presence my soul takes delight," by Joseph Swain. Phelps revised 3 of Swain's verses and added 2 more to create Redeemer of Israel. Today, only 4 of Phelps' verses are sung. Phelps' lyrics first appeared in the Evening and Morning Star in 1832, and the hymn was included in the church's first official hymnal in 1835. Please join us in singing Redeemer of Israel.
Redeemer of Israel, our only delight, unmoved for a blessing we call, a shadow by day and a pillar by night, our King, our companion, our all. We know He is coming to gather His sheep, and bless them in Zion His love. For why in the valley of death should they weep, or alone in the wilderness roam? How long we have wandered as strangers in sin, and cried in the desert for thee. Our foes have rejoiced when our sorrows they see, but Israel will shortly be free. As children of Zion, the tidings for us, the tokens already appear. Fear not and be just, for the kingdom is ours, and the hour
Zion was written by Isaac Watts in the early 1700s. In the mid-1800s, Baptist minister Robert Lowry adopted the verses and added a chorus. The Lowry version is well loved today in the Church of Jesus Christ, Bickertonites. This version appeared in the RLDS hymn tradition in the early 1900s hymnal, Zion's Praises. The LDS Church hymnal today uses Isaac Watts' original version titled, Come We That Love the Lord. Please join us in singing We're Marching to Zion.
Come we that love the Lord, and let our joy be known. Join in the song and sweet joy. Join in the song and sweet joy. And bless the Lord from the host around the throne. We're marching to Zion. Beautiful, beautiful Zion. We're marching away to Zion. Beautiful city of God. Let those we used to sing who never knew God. My children of the heavenly King, my children of the heavenly King, may joy their joys on joy is not, their joy is not. We're marching to Zion, beautiful, beautiful Zion. We're marching away to Zion, beautiful city of God. The birds of Zion use on mountains and streets. Before we reach the heavenly, before we reach the heavenly, oh, wonderful streets, oh, wonderful streets. We're marching to Zion, beautiful, beautiful Zion. We're marching away to Zion, beautiful city of God. The songs of love and every tear we cry. We're marching through in Randall's ground. We're marching through in Randall's ground. To carols of night is where all the night. We're marching to Zion, beautiful, beautiful Zion. We're marching away to Zion, beautiful city of God.
The Spirit of God Like a Fire is Burning, W. Phelps wrote about the spiritual experiences in the Kirtland Temple leading up to its dedication. The song was performed at the dedication service from all four choir boxes, creating 1836 surround sound. The original song had 6 verses, but today only 4 are regularly sung. This song continues to unite the scattered saints of the Restoration. Please join us in singing The Spirit of God Like a Fire is Burning.
The Spirit of God like a fire is burning, a matchless glory begins to come forth. The visions and blessings of old are returning, the angels are coming to visit the earth. We'll sing and we'll shout with the armies of heaven. Hosanna, Hosanna to God and the Lamb. Let glory to Him in the highest be given, and forever, amen and amen. The Lord is extending His saints' understanding, restoring their judges and all others. The knowledge and power of God are expanding, the armies of heaven. Hosanna, Hosanna to God and the Lamb. Let glory to them in the highest be given, henceforth and forever. Amen and amen. We call in our solemn assemblies to spirit, to spread forth the kingdom of heaven, O God, that we through our faith may begin to inherit the visions and blessings and glories of God. We'll sing and we'll shout with the armies of heaven. Hosanna, Hosanna to God and the Lamb. Let glory to them in the highest be given, henceforth and forever. Amen and amen. How blessed the day when the land and the vine shall lie down together with God and God. And give from the promise His blessing inside, and Jesus is there with His chariots of fire. We'll sing and we'll shout with the armies of heaven. Hosanna, Hosanna to God and the Lamb. Let glory to them in the highest be given, henceforth and forever. Amen and amen.
Thank you for the beautiful voices who contributed to our Hymn Fest. We know that you were joining along with our choir. It has been a pleasure to have you with us at our inaugural digital event. We look forward to seeing you at the October 2021 St. George Conference, where we can continue our conversations on restoration history. We thank our speakers who have enlightened us. Once again, check your screen for the donation link to strengthen the many JWHA programs that add to restoration history. Now please participate in our brief survey so we can capture your thoughts about the digital event. Again, thank you.